From Melbourne to the hallways of Oxford University, Aussie guy Matt Perry, creator and CEO of the Sociability app, joins us to discuss how he is on a mission to empower disabled people to enjoy better social inclusion and meaningful equality of opportunity. We also chat about the obvious yet often overlooked economic benefit of accessibility. Matt, hello.
Hi, Viv. How are you?
I'm well. Your setup looks amazing. It also sort of looks like one of those Zoom default backgrounds of a library.
Yeah, it's
Well
very
done, Matt.
curated.
Yeah. For accessibility reasons, we were asking people if we could start off, if you wouldn't mind doing a visual description of yourself. So just what you look like in the setting that you're in.
Sure. I'm a 31-year-old male with dark hair, dark eyebrows, um, seated at a desk in front of a bookshelf and a messy kitchen.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like I've been counting down the days since I met you just to chat and pick your brain. So you're welcome for the next hour of your life. You are in my hands. um, in sort of prepping for this moment, I was just checking out your resume and all of the incredible things you've done, and I'm I, rather than rattling it off, I'm sort of curious in all of the things that you've achieved. Is this like, can you sort of describe a through line or a theme from the things you've studied to the things you've sort of dabbled in with your career?
That's a good question. The short answer is probably no. I think on my end, I've been a very fortunate mixture of super lucky and been very fortunate to have benefited from a lot of really privileged opportunities, but also people I think believing in me, which has been a real pleasure and something I'm very grateful for. On my end, I think it's been a mixture of just following things I'm passionate about, and then trying to do things that I believe in. So I think that sort of has meant that I've started things and left and gone to do other stuff when didn't quite feel right, or I've tried to start things where they sort of didn't exist because I felt like that was something that I wanted to do and spend my time on, and that's kind of led me through a mixture of primarily study, to be honest, but also working in different environments, and then now at a startup.
And for those at home, when you say things, you're like very casually brushing over some pretty impressive studies. What are like? Can you paint a picture? What are the things that you have studied?
Sure. In my undergrad, I did a mixture of journalism and foreign languages, which is definitely something I'm passionate about and really enjoy. Being able to kind of tap into other cultures by learning their language and then learning about them. I was then fortunate to do a postgrad law degree, and then got the opportunity to come and study in the UK, and did two masters: a master's in public policy, and then a master's in what's called social science of the internet, but essentially is about how technology impacts society and changes how people behave and how we interact with each other.
Sort of the takeaway that I've gotten from a lot of the things that you've gone out and just committed to, from the social enterprise you founded that we'll get into a little later on, to your work at Sociability, and bits of your advocacy, is that, in essence, you're a young guy, and there's been so many moments where you just want to go out and have fun, and there's just been barriers presented to you, from going out with your friends to trying to access cafes and venues. Can you sort of speak to that experience of just those sort of frustration points, and then you just going, I'm just going to create a solution?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think probably relevant context is so I had a spinal cord injury when I was 15 playing AFL at school. And so I use a wheelchair now, and I've used wheelchairs since. And I think that was definitely for me a real eye opening experience, just in the sense of, from the day before to the day after, my whole life shifted. But I think what particularly was a combination of confusing slash frustrating for me was that everybody looked at me differently. And so there was all of a sudden all these kind of stereotypes and preconceptions around who I was, who I would be, what I wanted to do, what I could do, what I should do. because all of a sudden I was using a wheelchair. And for me, for all intents and purposes, I was just now sitting down. There's some more, there's definitely more elements to spinal cord injuries, but in terms of like who I was and my ambitions and interests, none of that had changed. I just sort of had to go about them in a different way. And yet I found it really frustrating that I would go into spaces or I would, apply to do things. And I was just met with a wall of skepticism, but also this kind of somewhat, benign kind of protection mentality. People, you shouldn't do this, it's not safe, or you shouldn't try that, that's going to be too hard, or for your own safety or well-being, don't do these things. And not only myself but my friends and family just also found it super frustrating, because I think it was very much foreign to us, and that's partly also related to the fact that I had not really had any interaction with disability or didn't know any kind of visibly disabled people beforehand. And so definitely was a big learning curve. But I think that was something that just didn't feel right, and didn't, for better or worse, sort of happened to be blessed with the gift of stubbornness. And it just felt like something that shouldn't sort of persist. And that has definitely sort of guided a lot of my actions and activities around what I feel needs to change in the disability space, particularly for young disabled people. But exactly to your point, a lot of what I've done is simply to try and find ways to do the things that I was otherwise doing or wanted to do with my friends, which are, not particularly sophisticated. It's sort of going out and spending time with each other and having fun.
You've kind of spoken before, not directly with me, but about your relationship with the word, the language, and how important it is. And specifically this sort of identity first and people first, and mainly this word disability. Where are you at with language and sort of the, and I speak to this as well coming from a perspective, Remarkable use things like disability tech, and more commonly we're using reference to the disability economy. And how do you think language plays a role in the work you're doing, personally and professionally?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a really important part. I mean, I think there is definitely, I'll caveat by saying I think definitely it can become sometimes the focus of things and like the kind of core concern or debate, which I think is probably a distraction. But, the way in which we talk about things influences the way in which we think about things, and that therefore influences how we act. On my end, I think having personally sort of gone a bit of full circle with the word disability specifically, or disabled. When I first had my accident, I was very adamant I was not disabled. I didn't have a disability. I had an injury, and I didn't really want to be associated with the disabled community. And that was, a lot of internalized ableism, really. That, what I just said before, that like people have been bombarded with these stories about being disabled, and it sucks. And so you naturally don't want to be in the sucky group. Over time, I've definitely become much more confident and comfortable with the fact that I have a disability, and it doesn't really mean much in terms of who I am or what I can do, in a sort of a macro sense. I'm not going to be running up any stairs anytime soon, but I'll take the ramp. And that doesn't, to me, kind of import any value, right? I'm not better or worse because I use the ramp instead of the stairs. And I think for me, I've sort of settled on the idea that actually it's really important to, whatever we want to call it, but like reclaim the word disability. People talk about how the word disabled is a really negative one, and therefore we shouldn't use it. But not using the word doesn't make it less negative. It just puts it out of sight, out of mind. And also every other word that people use instead is very clearly replacing disability. It's not like we've kind of come up with some separate term that is not associated with the concept. We just use a kind of a mixture of sort of pretend things like special abilities, or petite, differently abled, or whatever it might be. And I think the real concern there is that we're not actually solving the problem, which is that we have this false association of negativity with the concept of disability, and simply rebranding it doesn't remove that. It just like pushes it under the rug. And so I don't have a problem now with saying disabled or disability, because I'd rather say it and actually just like counter the argument that it's negative, than to sort of just pretend that it doesn't exist. And the reality is that there's so many kind of positive examples of disabled people out there, we just don't highlight them, or we don't sort of talk about that. And I think if we create a separate narrative around one of these other kind of euphemisms, it doesn't do the same job as if we just kind of directly tackle the stigma by calling it out. On the question of whether it's like disabled person or person with a disability, I don't have a particularly strong view. I think on my end, two things. I now live in the UK, and in the UK, there's definitely a bias towards disabled person as the sort of progressive version of this. And I think for me, it aligns a bit more with the social model of disability, which is that I'm disabled by my environment. I'm not a person who's sort of carrying around a disability. I have, a physical injury, but the fact that I'm disabled is because somebody's chosen to put a flight of stairs there instead of a ramp. And yeah, I think it kind of goes again to that point of really just owning this narrative and then trying to turn it around, rather than sort of hoping that if we don't sort of talk about it, people will forget it exists.
Yeah. And part of your work with your research, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's sort of looking at how these negative stereotypes influence a lot of policy.
Sure. Yep.
Have I got that right? And also to that point, what in that research have you found? Like, what are the main? Have you found any sort of just wow findings from diving into that area?
Yeah, I mean, I think the caveat is I don't think I add anything particularly novel to the kind of canon on this, but I'd probably say two things. One is I think definitely the stereotypes around disability that disabled people are told influence their behavior, even if they are disabled. So even if you disagree with it, because there is a dominant narrative of disability that exists in the media and in public systems and in things like the welfare system, particularly, disabled people are aware of this and know that they need to some extent, conform to that. And a bunch of my research focused on this idea that if you, particularly in the welfare system, if you create a stereotype and you build a system around it, disabled people will at some point conform to that stereotype in order to receive the benefit from that, because they still need that benefit, whether it's monetary or some sort of other accommodation. And if you do so, and you kind of entrench this enough and you make it extreme enough, then that's something they start to internalize. And this is, again, like not a thing just specific to disability. It's known as stereotype threat. But essentially, it's this idea that if you tell people they are X and you make them have to kind of demonstrate X, over time they will just become X. And it's very hard to sort of push back against that. My kind of further, I guess, take on this is that I think part of the problem is that the way in which we design these public systems, so things like the welfare system particularly, are intrinsically based on these stereotypes, and that's why we've built these systems this way. And so if you start with a stereotype and you build a system around it, and then you force people to behave that way in order to activate, or receive those the things the system is offering, you just create a cycle in which so you're self-reinforcing and justifying your approach. And I think something like the NDIS is a good attempt to actually reverse that. It's sort of taking away, sort of pushing against this very ordeal mechanism model of welfare, where only the people who really can survive the tough, grueling process are the most worthy, which is not true, and been proven incorrect, and turn it into this model of like, well, what do people need in order to achieve a goal in a much more positive and progressive way? And I think that, I don't think the NDIS is perfect, but I think that definitely is an important shift, because it helps disabled people think about what their potential could be and what they need to achieve it, rather than spending, as is in the UK, spending the whole assessment process for welfare and support, highlighting how incapacitated they are and highlighting how difficult their lives are, and sort of trying to justify why they need some meager support. Then as soon as they demonstrate any progress away from that kind of baseline, it's taken away. And I think that in of itself entices, or sort of locks people in to being very consistent with that really poor stereotype. And so I think these systems and laws and kind of structures that we create, which people sort of take as objective because they're not, it's not a human sort of making a decision, at least on the face of it, they have a huge role to play in terms of how we think about disability as a society.
And in terms of your work at Sociability, is part of your your motivation there to be part of the sort of an attempt to break a cycle from some angle? Is there anything that you're doing there that's really trying to change that narrative and therefore change these bigger policies that are being made?
Yeah, I think, at a kind of high level for sure, in terms of probably a few different things. One is, we're not a charity, we're a business, we're a technology company, and the goal really is to push, that's actually more so for a philosophical reason. It's to push against this narrative that like disability is necessarily associated with charity, because historically the conversation around disability is that disabled people should be pitied and they need your help, and you should give to them, when you can, because it's the good thing to do. But 1 in 5 people have a disability of some kind. Most of those are acquired, and most of those are invisible. And the disabled population, at least in the UK, has a huge untapped economic spending power. The rough estimates are for disabled people and their friends and family, it's around £274 billion a year of spending power, most of which is not tapped into because of stupid things like a lack of accessibility, or a lack of accessibility on the website, or just the kind of general poor quality service for disabled customers. And in the same way that organizations or businesses will pay to attract more customers who are not disabled through marketing or through amenities or making their spaces more enjoyable to be in, the disabled population should be catered to, because they're people who have money to spend and who want to do things, not because there's some sort of guilt associated with letting in the kind of token wheelchair user. That's not to say I don't agree with the argument that this is just an equity thing and we should just do this because it's a human rights issue. I definitely agree with that, but I think part of the problem is that if we just put disabled people in a separate bucket, they'll always be othered, and you end up with these policies that are inclusive but othering, right? Which is sort of where we are today, where you'll go to a restaurant and the accessible entrance will be around the back, through the kitchen and the garbage area. No other patrons have to walk through the garbage chute to get into the restaurant, but there's a sense that for disabled people, we have a separate approach and a separate thing, and to some extent they should be grateful that we've done that. It's not built into the framework of running a business or opening a restaurant, for example. It's bolted on as like a luxury and a value, and until we start to see disabled people as equal consumers and customers, which is what these businesses are looking for, right? It's a commercial setting. It'll always be a nice to have rather than a must have for a lot of these organizations. And so sociability, what we're trying to do, I guess, is help kickstart that change by making it easier for disabled people to go into these spaces and to just be seen. The caveat obviously is a lot of disabilities are invisible, but the general point is that the more disabled people you can get out and about, the more you start to break down these stereotypes that they don't want to go out, that they can't go out, that they're not interested. And unfortunately for disabled people, in a world that's not built with accessibility in mind, knowledge is the real driver that will help facilitate this. It would be great if tomorrow every building was built with some sort of level of universal accessibility, but that one isn't going to happen, and two, there isn't sort of this universal standard of accessibility anyway. And so to the extent that we can help disabled people plan ahead and figure out where they can go and choose, have actual empowered decisions in this context, I think that, at least on our understanding of the world, is going to make a big difference in terms of then driving representation and driving kind of more positive stereotypes. What we're trying to do at Sociability really is collect accessibility information and organize it and then give it to the right people. Initially, that's to users and individuals, but ultimately that will be to other organizations to enhance their services and unlock those for disabled people. And I think the more we can start to use technology in a really positive, impactful way for what has largely been a forgotten population in terms of the tech boom, we can make huge gains in terms of inclusion and equality.
And you referenced sort of the in the UK, I believe it's called the Purple Pound. Am I right in that? Can you sort of speak to what, I don't know it off the top of my head, but what the current status of the Purple Pound is, how much we're talking?
Yeah, so the purple pound, at least, I mean, I think estimates will shift, but the sort of latest one is around 274 billion pounds per year of spending power for disabled people and their friends and family. And that's important, right? Because like if I go to a restaurant with my girlfriend, if there's a step there and we can't get in, we both go elsewhere. Or if I'm with a group of friends, I don't just sit outside while they go inside. And in the same way that establishments have really embraced the idea of dietary requirements, and particularly vegetarianism and veganism. It's the exact same logic. If you went with a group of 10 people to a steak restaurant and one of them was vegan, you would all just go elsewhere. You would just like let them look at the steak. And I think that's the same thing that would happen with disabled people, but we don't have the same narratives around like disabled people going out with their friends and families to restaurants and bars and clubs, right? The narratives are the disabled person is at home ordering Deliveroo, by themselves, which is not true. And part of the kind of our mission at Sociability is to facilitate that reality, which people don't see, but to make it much more commonplace.
And have you seen any examples of venues that have been listed through Sociability? I suppose both ends of the spectrum. Have you seen them being listed in a way and it being a positive review, and then they improve their accessibility on top of that? And like on the other end, I don't know exactly how Sociability works, but have you seen people being sort of pointed out as not being accessible and then getting any pushback?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, to kind of step back, so Sociability is this platform. What is the technology company I've started? We're based in East London, and we're building a platform. We've built a platform where anybody can go and find information about the accessibility of local venues, particularly so cafes, restaurants, bars, small format hospitality and retail sites, and you can find that information in a level of detail that allows you to decide whether or not that space is accessible for you. Dependent on your personal needs and preferences, but also in contexts. Because I think historically, people have said, yeah, I'm sure my venue's accessible. And they don't know whether you're a wheelchair user or whether you're blind or whether you're coming with one person or whether you're coming for half an hour or the whole evening. There's no way in which they can sort of meaningfully tell you a space is accessible unless they know who you are, what you're doing, why you're coming, etc. And so we want to use technology to help break that down and actually understand who our users are and pair it with really detailed information that is as objective as possible and give people that confidence and peace of mind that venue X will suit them in on day Z and in a particular context Y. And that I think is something which we can do given the data we're collecting and the technology we're building. To your point about like how people are responding, both users and businesses, for sure. I mean, we've seen that businesses are reaching out to us now, which is super exciting, asking how, one, they can better communicate their accessibility to users, to customers, because sometimes for better or worse, a customer turns up and their expectations are not met. Either they've been told a venue is accessible, and again, what I said before, wasn't accessible to them, or they've been told something exists when in reality it didn't, or they've sort of just turned up not knowing, and they've just been disappointed that they wouldn't be able to enter. And that is worse for everybody, right? If somebody turns up on your doorstep and you can't help them, rather than if they were able to prepare and plan at home or before they left. And so we've definitely had a growing interest in people reaching out to ask how best to communicate this information in the same way that businesses will otherwise share their address or their opening hours or their dietary requirement information. And the second thing we've definitely seen is that there's a growing kind of awareness of which businesses do and don't have accessible accommodations. At Sociability, we definitely try to take a much more positive and constructive approach to accessibility. And so we're very hesitant to go down the kind of name and shame and sort of, we're very much of the idea that the more we can encourage people to see the positives around disability inclusion, the more productive that will be. But for sure, there's definitely cases where people will flag that venues don't have X or don't have Y, and I think more importantly, aren't interested in having X or Y. And that is something which, I think is also important for the community to be aware of, so that they don't end up at a space where they're not, welcome. And part of the logic is that, people will vote with their feet. The, users will go to places that have a much more progressive and welcoming approach to disabled customers. That's the whole point, if you are building a restaurant or a cafe or a bar or a nightclub that's inclusive, you get more people coming. And particularly post COVID, we're seeing a huge interest from organizations to try and increase that foot traffic. And a very simple way to do it is to make your space as accessible as possible.
Mm. And I suppose bringing it back, into the tech side of building an app about accessibility, Remarkable are the first to flag. We absolutely are committed to driving inclusive, accessible tech. However, we don't always get it right in the tools that we use and the things that we've built. And I think that sort of honesty is part of the process in going, we're not going to get it right all the time, but we're committed. And I'm curious to know, as you've been developing this app, have there been parts of the app itself that you've had to sort of navigate that weren't accessible because the technology wasn't available yet to just design an app completely accessibly from the get-go?
Yeah, I mean definitely, and we're very much in the same boat, that we're building a tool about physical or real world accessibility, but it's a digital tool. It's available on mobile and web, and it similarly has to be as accessible as possible. Otherwise, it's not helpful, and it's also highly ironic. So on our end, I think to your point, also take this approach that accessibility, particularly from a digital standpoint, but just generally, is not a sort of set and forget thing. It's not a tick box exercise. You can't say, great, it's accessible now, I can just carry on. It is an attitude. It's an ongoing kind of evolving thing. And, on our end, accessibility is all about people. It's all about functionality. It's about how somebody can use something or do something in a way that, meets their needs. And to that extent, as the platform evolves and changes and we add new features and kind of, get user feedback about X, Y, or Z, we have to consider accessibility at all stages. So on our end, we've done our, kind of best to get it up to a baseline, and we're always looking to actively improve it. But, really, we're very fortunate that we're building a community where users are able to feed back to us pretty directly what does and doesn't work. And as a company, we're prioritizing making those changes around accessibility as soon as possible, as as the kind of highest priority. And I think to your point, it's definitely a learning curve, but also in an exciting sort of sense. We're building, I guess, an internal expertise around how to build an accessible digital product, because exactly to your point, there aren't a lot of it's not a problem that's been solved. Put it that way. And there's definitely guidelines and kind of best practice and things like that, but not a lot of it. And part of the challenge is, how do you also make something that is highly accessible and cool and fun and like exciting to use, right? That doesn't look like it was built in a hospital. And I think on our end, to answer your question, one specific area we've found that's a little bit challenging is, using a map. We've built a tool that is based around this idea of finding things nearby and local venues. And we went with a map initially as to the kind of layout and format. Maps are not particularly easy for people with visual impairments to navigate. And so that's something we've taken on board in terms of feedback. And, without going too much into the detail, the next version of the app will sort of be pushing a little bit away from the idea of the map as the central interface, because it's something that is not fully accessible to everybody. And that's been a really useful learning curve on our end, of also just challenging some of the preconceptions that we have around how the platform should look and feel. But also the reality is, like, I'm a wheelchair user, so I am biased as to what accessibility things are more or less apparent. And what we're really trying to do as a team is like really broaden our understanding of what accessibility means for the kind of the pan disability spectrum. And that's definitely a challenge, but a really rewarding.
And you've spoken about this idea that there's this fear of workplaces not taking accessibility, I don't know if seriously is the right word, but just not being forward about improving and making sure that their spaces are accessible. And there's also been a lot of talk about travel lately and how inaccessible that experience is for a lot of people, particularly I've been reading a lot of stories about wheelchair users. Is that what the future of sociability looks like? Will eventually people be able to rate, travel experiences and workplace experiences, or what is the future of sociability?
Yeah, I mean, for us, we really see, what we're doing as, really complementary to a lot of things, right? It's this idea that actually, Technology for lots of people, particularly for non-disabled people, has given them back brain space, right? So you can type into Google Maps point A and point B, and it just tells you how to get there. And you don't really need to think anymore. You don't need to read a map. You're not looking at the stars. You don't have a compass, right? It just like tells you when to get on the bus or the tube or the taxi, and you just get there. Same with, booking sites like booking.com or open table or whatever it is. You have all these things at your fingertips, and we live in a world of so much information. A lot of these sites just help you pass that and kind of get to the things you need, and they take away that need to sort of use your brain to figure out a bunch of that stuff. For disabled people, that doesn't work. Disabled people are still working to do all those things, and often 2 or 3, 4, 5 times harder than non-disabled people, and that takes energy and time. So for me to book a restaurant or to me to book a hotel takes much longer than somebody who doesn't have a disability, who can just go online and click the price and the location and pick something they like. And so at Sociability, our mission is really to organize the world's accessibility information in a way that removes this anxiety and this stress and this time and this effort for all these tasks that still exist for disabled people today, because the platforms and technologies that we've built don't have the right information. So, I can't use Google Maps to readily find a way to get from point A to B because it doesn't know which forms of transport are accessible to me. If we can help them unlock that, that means that for disabled people, transport is much easier, and we don't need to build a navigation platform or a booking site or whatever it is. The goal really is to help unlock all these other existing platforms and services, and to really be, in some sense, that idea of like a layer of the internet that can help facilitate and empower disabled people to access all these other services and platforms that exist, and to give them back that brain space, to give them back that time, and to give them back that kind of confidence and peace of mind that they don't have, but that other people have and take for granted. And I think the more we can do that, the more we can help people get onto an equal playing field. We can really help people start from the same position, and then we can start to see what happens when you empower disabled people to fundamentally engage with the world from the same position, rather than starting from 10 meters back on the starting line and wondering why they struggle to kind of get to the starting line in the first place. And that's what I'm excited about. I think technology has this huge potential to really lift a lot of people who've been marginalized for so long to a much more engaged and fulfilling position. It just hasn't kind of been turned to that. We spend a lot of our time using technology that is sort of geared towards helping people make profit for activities that I don't think create a lot of social good. And so our mission is to really try and use it for something that's hopefully much more worthwhile, but also that has a really big ripple effect. And that's the kind of broader ambition of what we're doing.
And I touched on it a little earlier, but you established a social enterprise with your friends called Wheels in Motion many moons ago, I think, and that also hosts an annual dance party called Move With Us in Melbourne, which is a fully accessible dance party. And then you jump to your work with Sociability, which is again trying to drive home this idea that access to a venue, be a pub, a bar, a nightclub, a cafe, is access to anywhere is a human right. But all of your work you're doing, there's this sort of like fundamental young guy in you that just wants to go out and get a beer without stress and have a good time with his friends. And it's incredible the energy that you've dedicated to just going, look, at the moment it's not possible. There's so many barriers in my way to be able to do this without all of the added work I have to do to figure out if I can get in the door. How does that does that affect the energy after all of these years? Are you feeling more motivated, or do you ever get those moments of just going, man, I just want to go for a beer already?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely like not the most relaxing career choice. And I think on my end, part of the challenge is that I'm working in a space that I also live, right? So like, even if I finish work, I still struggle, and I finish work and I want to go to dinner. I still struggle to find a place to go to dinner. So like, I'm sort of reminded of work. So I think to that extent, that's the kind of trade-off of if you work in a space that you also feel passionately about, but also you live. It is kind of always on, and I think to your point, it is also tiring. I mean, I'm very fortunate to kind of live in a space where I have a lot of support and friends and family who help make those things easy, and also I have learnt to kind of navigate the world in a way in which I don't feel a lot of the barriers anymore, which is partly just luck based on the disability I have and the way in which I can move around, but two, also very fortunate to live in an environment where the accessibility is good enough that that I can do most things that I need to. In terms of, I guess, energy for like what I'm doing, because I think it's something that I just feel intrinsically, it's not something that that wanes. There's definitely better or worse days, and I think one thing that I've had to learn over time, was told by a mentor of mine who is also a wheelchair user, who's a bit older, was that you just really do need to pick and choose your battles. You can't always advocate for everything all the time, everywhere, because you'll just go nuts. And I think that's definitely something which I've had to learn to personally kind of calibrate, particularly as I sort of work more and more in this space. But yeah, I think on my end, the exciting thing is I think that in the 3 years I've been doing sociability and the kind of 6 or 7 years we've been running Wheels in Motion, I've already seen a lot of change, and I think that's something which not a lot of advocates or not a lot of people kind of in the social justice movement can often say, that in the first 3 to 5 years they genuinely see change. I think a lot of people are banging their heads against the wall for decades, and I think I am excited by the fact that I think now is a time in which we can make and are making genuine progress. And it's exciting and in some sense quite humbling to be a part of that. So yeah, I think on my end I've still got a bit more energy, and we'll keep going for a little bit longer. But there's definitely, I think, a nice kind of growing light at the end of the tunnel.
So cool. And I'm conscious of time, and I suspect you have got a busy day. Sometimes I like to sing my words, Matt. That's what I do. But at the end of these, I mentioned that we like to ask guests, like your lovely self, to end on a remarkable insight. And that sort of is a title that encompasses whatever you feel speaks to you most, whether that's a piece of advice, words of wisdom, a fact about the progress and the change that's happened, or the future of sociability. So it's a broad one, but I'm going to pass the mic to you, and if there's one thing you'd like to leave people with, go ahead.
Sure. I think it probably goes back to your very first question, actually, which is, I think that at the end of the day, we as people can choose to do lots of different things. And I think the biggest learning on my end has been that if you choose to do things that you're passionate about and you believe in, and you work hard at those, but also you kind of put into the world the energy that you think should come out of it, it'll hopefully all be okay. But I think on my end, it's been a really important lesson to actually be comfortable doing things that I think people will disagree with, or tell you that it's not possible, or say that's never going to happen. If you are passionate about it and you really believe in what you're doing, and you think there's a really good reason for why it should exist or you should be doing it, that's the main thing. And you spend a lot of your time working and sort of trying to be productive. And if you're not doing it for something that you believe in or you're passionate about, then why are you doing it? So I think on my end, not sure how remarkable it is, but my insight would simply be that I think with people who are thinking about ideas and have these things in their mind, and they're wondering whether or not they should sort of take that first step to go and pursue something which they've been told is not feasible or sounds silly or they shouldn't do it. I think the main driver is, are you passionate about it and do you believe in it? And I think that's the kind of, for me, the key criterion of whether or not it'll be a success. And if you have the right mindset, I really do think anything is possible.